The road trip that led me to my true self. The sun had barely touched the horizon when we hit the road, the Lagos traffic still asleep, a rare scene in a city that never truly rests. It was the day I chose to escape my routine and take a leap away from everything I thought defined me. My best friend, Chike, had been talking about a trip to Oyo State for weeks. He had sold it as a chance to unwind, but I sensed he saw it as something deeper for me. He kept calling it my reckoning, and I wasn't sure if he was joking or serious. We'd been close since childhood, with Chike always the adventurous one. I, on the other hand, had grown up sticking to the plan, holding fast to routine. I worked a steady job in Lagos, counted my savings, and maintained an image. But lately, a persistent feeling of emptiness gnawed at me. Was this really it? Was this how my life was meant to be? Chike drove, his playlist filling the silence as we breezed through the outskirts of Lagos. I could see the city retreating in the rearview mirror, leaving behind its chaos, its fast-talking people, and its never-ending stream of responsibilities. I felt lighter with every kilometer we covered. "Do you feel it yet?" Chike asked, a grin on his face. I rolled my eyes, but he wasn't wrong. There was something about leaving the city that felt liberating, even if I didn't fully understand why. After about 2 hours on the road, the landscape began to change. The concrete jungle of Lagos melted into sprawling farmlands, vibrant with green and dotted with farmers tending to crops. We passed roadside vendors selling roasted corn and plantains, their smoky aroma filling the air. The colors, the smells, it was all so different from the sterile, sanitized life I'd crafted for myself in Lagos. "Stop the car," I heard myself say. Chike raised an eyebrow but pulled over without question. I stepped out, the humid air clinging to me, the sun hotter now, settling over my skin like a warm blanket. I walked to one of the vendors, an elderly woman with skin as rough as the yam peels beside her. She smiled, her eyes twinkling as I picked up a roasted corn. "Oh, city boy likes it local, eh?" Chike teased, laughing as he leaned against the car. But he joined me, and we ate in silence, the earthiness of the corn grounding me, a connection to something raw and real. I felt strangely alive, like I had finally stepped into the present moment. Back in the car, we continued our journey. The roads twisted and turned as we left the highways behind. Soon, the air cooled as we drove into the hilly terrain of Oyo. I gazed out the window at the rustic beauty, trying to absorb it all. My thoughts drifted, a mix of childhood memories and a growing sense of urgency, an itch I couldn't scratch. The path I'd chosen for my life no longer seemed as secure as it once had. The sun was setting when we arrived at an old guest house Chike had booked. It was humble but charming, with clay walls painted a soft shade of pink and a small courtyard filled with wildflowers. That night, after a dinner of pounded yam and egusi, we sat outside, watching the stars punctuate the night sky. They were clearer here than I'd ever seen in Lagos. "What's stopping you, man?" Chike's voice broke the silence. He didn't need to elaborate. He knew. And he was the only person who knew that I'd spent years struggling to fit into a mold that was slowly cracking. "I don't know," I replied, staring up at the stars. "There's comfort in routine, you know. I know what to expect. I know who I am." "Do you?" he challenged, a hint of irritation in his voice. "Or do you just know who you think you're supposed to be?" His words struck a chord. Maybe that was why I'd come along on this trip. Not to escape Lagos, but to escape the version of myself that I'd carefully constructed, piece by piece. The next morning, we set off to hike a trail Chike had heard about. It was said to lead to a sacred spot, an ancient rock formation that had stood the test of time. Legend had it that whoever touched the rock could confront their true self. It sounded like folklore, but something about it intrigued me. As we climbed, the air grew thinner, our breaths more labored. My legs ached, but I pushed forward, determined. I'd spent years hiding from myself. If there was a chance to look into the mirror of my soul, I was willing to fight for it. Finally, we reached the rock. It stood majestically against the backdrop of the blue sky, massive and unmoving. I placed a hand on its cool surface, feeling a strange sensation coursing through me. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, memories flooded my mind, moments I had buried, feelings I had suppressed. I saw myself as a boy, wandering through my father's old bookshop, curious and wide-eyed. I remembered the thrill of discovering stories, each one a world of its own. I remembered dreams of becoming a writer, of weaving my own words. Somewhere along the way, I had abandoned that dream, convinced myself it was foolish, and settled into a life of practicality. My heart pounded as I opened my eyes, my hand still pressed against the rock. I looked at Chaik, who was watching me with a knowing smile. "That's it, isn't it?" he said softly. "That's what you've been running from." I nodded, feeling a surge of clarity I hadn't felt in years. I had been running from myself, from the boy who had dared to dream, the boy who saw life as a canvas waiting to be painted with stories and adventures. I had traded my passion for security, my creativity for a steady paycheck. And now, standing on this ancient rock, I felt the weight of that choice lift from my shoulders. The journey back felt different. The sun was brighter, the air crisper. I felt alive, like a piece of me that had been locked away was finally set free. We drove back to Lagos in silence, both of us knowing that something had changed. When I got home, I opened a blank notebook and picked up a pen. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to dream again. I wrote with abandon, my thoughts pouring onto the page, messy and imperfect, but honest. I wrote the story of a man who had forgotten his purpose, who had lost himself in the noise of the world, only to rediscover it on a dusty road leading to a sacred rock in the heart of Oyo. And as I wrote, I realized something profound. The journey to my true self wasn't about finding something new. It was about remembering who I had always been.